Imagine walking through a cemetery so old that the trees have grown into the walls, their roots cracking the stone foundations, reclaiming what was once consecrated ground. The year carved into the iron gate reads 1789. The fog sits low over the grass, and your breath forms small clouds in the cold autumn air. You came here for one reason. You found a name in an old family Bible, a name written in faded ink, with a date of death beside it, and now you are standing in front of the grave. The stone is green with moss, leaning slightly to the left, as if the earth itself has been slowly pulling it down. You crouch and brush away the wet leaves with your hand. The inscription is worn, but readable. A name, a date. And then, where you expected to see a cross, where every other stone in this cemetery bears the image of a crucifix, or an angel or a lamb, this stone has something different. Two interlocked tools carve with precision that seems almost impossible for the time, a square, a compass, and centered between them, watching you from across 2 centuries, a single unblinking eye. You stand up slowly, you look around at the other graves. Your neighbor's stone has a cross, the stone beside it has a weeping angel. But that this man, your ancestor, the one your grandmother called just a simple farmer from Vermont, carries a symbol that has nothing to do with farming and everything to do with one of the most powerful secret fraternities in the history of the Western world. You were told he was ordinary, but the stone tells a different story. And once you learn to read these symbols, once you understand the code that will deliberately carved into granite and slate and marble across hundreds of cemeteries in New England, in Scotland, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, you will never look at your family history the same way again. Because here is what they never told you. In the 18th and 19th centuries, membership in the guild was not a hobby, it was not a civic club, like the Rotary or the Chamber of Commerce. It was a blood oath, a sworn covenant that bound men and their sons and their sons' sons to a network of mutual protection, shared secrets, and ancient knowledge that stretched back not decades, but centuries, back to the cathedral builders of medieval Europe, back to the stonemasons who raised the Gothic arches of Notre Dame and Chartres, back, some would argue, to something far older and far more dangerous to admit. And when those men died, they could not speak their affiliation openly. The oath demanded silence. But they could leave a message, carved in stone, hidden in the will, cut inside the lining of a coat, passed down through generations. They left the keys for their own blood to find, knowing that someday someone who carried their name would stand in front of that grave and ask the right question. You are that person. And this is that key. To understand why these symbols are in your family cemetery, you have to go back, not to colonial America, not even to the founding of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, but to the cold stone floors of the great medieval building sites of Europe, where men learned to cut rock into shapes that could hold the weight of the sky. The stonemasons of the Middle Ages were not ordinary labourers. They were the engineers of their age, possessing mathematical and architectural knowledge so advanced and so jealously guarded that they formed closed brotherhoods to protect it. These were the builders of the great cathedrals, the men who understood geometry not merely as a technical skill, but as a sacred language. They believed that the perfect arch, the precise right angle, the harmonious proportion, were not human inventions, but divine blueprints encoded into the fabric of creation. To master them was to touch the mind of the Creator. Their guilds had secrets, not merely trade secrets about how to cut stone, though those existed too, but IPA secrets, rituals of initiation that marked the transition from apprentice to flow craftsman to master. Sacred words and gestures that allowed a mason working in Paris to identify a fellow craftsman in a tavern in London without speaking a single compromising word. These were men who worked across borders, across languages, hired by kings and bishops and princes to raise the monuments of Christendom. They needed a private language, and they built one. Now follow this thread carefully, because this is where the story becomes extraordinary. In the early 14th century, something catastrophic happened to another powerful secret order. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the King of France and the Pope launched a coordinated surprise arrest of the Knights Templar across Europe. These were warrior monks who had accumulated not only vast military power, but also enormous financial and architectural resources. The Templars had built fortresses and chapter houses across the known world. They understood construction at the highest level, and when the order was dismantled, when their leaders were burned at the stake and their assets seized, a significant number of them vanished. History loses their trail. But tradition, stubborn and persistent, picks it up again in Scotland. Scotland, in 1307, was the one kingdom in Europe that had reasons to welcome outlawed Templars. Robert the Bruce had himself been excommunicated, which meant the papal order of arrest carried no weight there. And in Scotland, already home to a fierce tradition of stone masonry, connected to the building of its great castles and abbeys, displaced Templars and their followers found a ready-made brotherhood to absorb their knowledge, their symbols, and their secrets. The stonemasons' guilds of Scotland were transformed. The knowledge of the Templar initiates, their understanding of sacred geometry, their protection of certain ancient texts and architectural traditions connected to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, was folded into the operative craft. What had been a guild of literal stonecutters began to accumulate a second layer, a speculative architecture built not in stone but in symbol and ritual. By the late 17th century, men who were not stonemasons at all were being initiated into these lodges. Lawyers, doctors, landowners, philosophers. The craft was going speculative. And in 1717, 4 London lodges formally organised into the Grand Lodge of England, creating the institution we now recognise as Freemasonry. That the men who joined those lodges carried something much older than 1717 inside their rituals. They carried the memory of the cathedral builders. They carried fragments of a tradition that reached back through the Templars to the architects of Solomon's Temple. Also they believed, and that belief shaped everything they did, including how they marked their graves when they died. This is the part you need to sit with, because this is where your family history intersects with this centuries-long current of hidden knowledge. Go to your archive. Find the oldest photographs you have, family headstones. If your family has roots in New England, in the mid-Atlantic states, in the American South, or in Scotland, Ireland, or the north of England, there is a statistically significant chance that at least one stone in your ancestral cemetery carries one of the following marks. Learn them, because once you know them, you will see them everywhere. The square and compass is the most recognized symbol of Freemasonry, but most people do not understand what it meant to the man who had it carved on his stone. The square represents morality, the commitment to deal with others honestly and without deviation. The compass represents the boundaries man places on his own conduct, the circumscription of desire and action within an ethical perimeter. Together they frame the letter G, which in lodge symbolism stands for both geometry and the grand architect of the universe. When you see this on a gravestone, you are not seeing a decorative element. You are seeing a man's final public statement of allegiance. He could not announce his lodge membership in the church announcement. He could not have it read from the pulpit. But he could have it cut into his stone, and every brother who passed that cemetery would recognize it instantly, look for variations. Sometimes the compass and square appear without the central G. Sometimes they appear inverted, with the points of the compass above the arms of the square, indicating that the man had achieved a higher degree of initiation. Sometimes only one element appears, a single compass or a single square, which may indicate a man who was initiated but never progressed beyond the first degree, or a family that wanted to minimize visibility while still leaving the mark. The acacia branch is subtler, and this is the one that most descendants miss entirely. In Masonic ritual, the acacia is the symbol of immortality and of the soul's survival after death. It is connected to the central legend of the craft, the story of Hiram Abiff, the master architect of Solomon's temple, who was murdered by 3 ruffians who wanted to extract the secret word of a master mason. When Hiram was buried, an acacia sprig was placed over his grave, and it was this sprig, green and living above the dead ground, that allowed the other masons to find his body. The acacia says, without words, that this man knew the legend, that he was initiated into the central mystery of the craft. When you see a carved branch on a gravestone, do not assume it is merely decorative. Look at the shape of the leaves. Acacia leaves are small, oval, and grow in symmetric pairs along a central stem. If the carving matches this pattern, you are looking at a signal. The all-seeing eye appears on your currency, and you have probably stopped seeing it as strange. But imagine encountering it in a rural Vermont cemetery in 1810, carved above the name of a man whose occupation was listed in county records as farmer. The eye, framed by a triangle or radiating sunbeams, is one of the oldest symbols in Masonic iconography, representing the omniscience of the Grand Architect and a belief that all moral actions are observed, even in the dark, even in secret. It also served as a subtle marker for brothers passing through unfamiliar territory. A man who knew the symbols would recognize the eye and know that someone who belonged to the fraternity had been buried in this ground. The 5-pointed star, a pentagram or pentacle, appears in Masonic context as the symbol of the blazing star, one of the 3 lesser lights of the lodge. It is associated with the figure of Venus, with the mathematical perfection of Pythagorean geometry, and with what lodges called the divine spark of intelligence in man. When you see a 5-pointed star on an 18th or 19th century gravestone, particularly one accompanied by other geometric motifs, do not assume it is merely patriotic or decorative. Stars in this period carried heavy symbolic weight, and the men who designed their own gravestones knew exactly what each element communicated. Now go to your family photographs. If you have images from the 19th century, men in formal dress, standing stiffly for the long exposure times of early photography, look at their hands. Look very carefully at their hands. The Masonic handshake, the grip, was one of the primary means by which initiated brothers identified each other in ordinary social settings. There were different grips for different degrees, each involving specific pressure points on the knuckles or the wrist. These were not secret in the conspiratorial sense of a hidden document. They were practical tools of recognition in an age before identity documents. And in photographs, particularly formal portraits, where men stood or sat beside each other, you will sometimes see a handshake or a hand placement that is slightly unusual. A thumb pressed to the top of the fingers rather than wrapped around the hand. A particular extension of the index finger. Two men clasping hands in a way that looks formal even by 19th century standards. This is not always what it looks like. Photography historians caution against over-interpretation. But if you see unusual hand positioning in a formal portrait of Ancestor, who also appears in lodge records, or whose gravestone carries any of the symbols described above, you may be looking at a deliberate signal. A final coded message preserved by accident in the chemistry of light and silver. The wills are where the most definitive evidence often hides, and they are more accessible than most people realize. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a significant number of Masonic lodge members included in their wills specific bequests, what they called widows and orphans. Sometimes this phrase appeared as a direct bequest, a sum of money to be distributed by the lodge to the families of deceased brothers. Sometimes it appeared more obliquely as a direction to a trusted friend or executor to make certain disbursements according to arrangements already understood. If you find this phrase in an ancestor's will, or any variation of it, you are likely looking at a coded reference to Masonic obligation. The fraternal obligation to care for the widows and orphans of fellow lodge members was one of the most important functions of these organizations in an era without social safety nets. A man who died knowing his wife and children would be looked after by his brothers had practical reasons, not merely sentimental ones, to maintain his lodge membership. The will was the final opportunity to fulfill his own obligations, while also leaving a marker of his affiliation that would make sense to anyone who knew the code and be invisible to anyone who did not. Look also for bequests to the lodge directly. In many 18th century wills, you will find a small monetary bequest, described simply as to the lodge, followed by a specific amount, often multiple of 3 or a number with Masonic significance, such as 7, 9, or 27. This was a dues payment made from beyond the grave, a final acknowledgement of membership. Watch for the names of executors. Masonic brothers frequently named fellow lodge members as executors of their estates, as this ensured that coded instructions would be properly carried out, and that lodge-related property, certain rings, aprons, jewels of office, would be handled appropriately rather than being sold as ordinary goods. If your ancestor named as his executor a man from a different town, a man with whom no obvious family or business connection explains the relationship, it is worth asking whether that executor appears in lodge records. The rings themselves are an entire category of evidence. Masonic rings were made in vast numbers during the 18th and 19th centuries, and many remain in family jewelry boxes, stored without identification, passed down with no explanation of their meaning. The most common design features, the square and compass on the face, sometimes with the letter G, sometimes set with a stone, sometimes in plain metal. But there are older and rarer rings that carry more obscure symbols: a beehive, symbolizing industry and the cooperative labor of the lodge, an hourglass, representing mortality. 2 pillars, representing the pillars of Boaz and Jachin, that stood at the entrance to Solomon's temple. If you have an old ring in your family with any of these motifs, have it examined by someone familiar with Masonic symbolism before assuming it is merely decorative antique jewelry. Now understand something about the families themselves. The fraternity did not spread randomly through American colonial and post-revolutionary society. It moved along specific networks, through specific professions, and it planted roots in specific families. If your family carried any of certain surnames, particularly surnames connected to the skilled trades, the law, to military service in the Revolutionary or Civil War periods, or to the merchant class of the colonial Atlantic seaboard, the probability of Masonic connection increases substantially. The founding generation of American Masonry was drawn disproportionately from men who already occupied positions of influence. Benjamin Franklin was a lodge master in Philadelphia before he was a statesman. George Washington was a master mason, initiated in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1752, and his Masonic apron, a gift from Lafayette, was the garment in which he was buried. Paul Revere served as Grand Master of the Massachusetts Grand Lodge. John Hancock, the Marquis de Lafayette, John Paul Jones, the list of founding-era figures connected to the fraternity reads like a roll call of the revolution itself. But below these famous names, in the lodges of every significant colonial and early republic town, were the men whose names you will not find in history books. The merchant who supplied the Continental Army, the printer who ran the Whig newspaper, the surveyor who laid out the new county seat, the doctor who served as regimental surgeon. These were the men who built the institutional infrastructure of the new nation, and a disproportionate number of them were brothers of the craft. Find the lodge records. This is more possible than most people believe. Many state Grand Lodges maintain historical archives that include membership lists owing back to the 18th century. The Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, founded in 1733, has records of extraordinary depth. The Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, the Grand Lodge of Virginia, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, which served as the mother lodge for many American chapters, all maintain archives. Some of these have been digitized, some are available through genealogy platforms, and some require a letter to the Grand Lodge archivist, a step that most researchers never take, but which frequently yields extraordinary results. What you are looking for in these records is simple: a name, a date of initiation, a lodge number and location. If you find your ancestor in those records, you have documentary confirmation of what the gravestone was already telling you in stone. The Scottish connection deserves particular attention, because Scotland was not merely a geographic origin point for many American families. It was the crucible in which the most esoteric strands of Masonic tradition were forged, and from which they were exported to the New World. Scottish Rite Freemasonry, distinct from the York Rite practiced in most English lodges, developed a system of 33 degrees of initiation, each building on the last, each revealing additional layers of the symbolic and philosophical architecture of the craft. The higher degrees of Scottish Rite Masonry incorporated elements drawn from medieval chivalric orders, from Rosicrucian philosophy, and from what practitioners described as the ancient mystery traditions of Egypt and Judea. Men who rose through these degrees believed they were accessing a genuine lineage of esoteric wisdom that stretched back not merely to the cathedral builders of the Middle Ages, but to the builders of the First Temple. If your family has Scottish origins, if you carry a surname that appears in the Scottish Burgess rolls or the records of the Scottish operative masonry guilds, the connection is not merely possible, it is probable. The stonemason guilds of Scotland, the Lodge of Edinburgh, the Lodge of Kilwinning, which claims to be the oldest Masonic lodge in the world, these were the direct institutional ancestors of the lodges your colonial-era ancestors joined when they arrived in Virginia or Massachusetts or Carolina. The markstones are perhaps the most ancient and least known of the material evidence. In operative stonemasonry, each master craftsman had a personal mark, a unique symbol he carved into every stone he cut, so that his work could be identified for payment and quality control purposes. These marks were personal property, passed from father to son within Masonic families, and they were taken with deadly seriousness. A mason who used another man's mark was subject to severe punishment under guild law. When speculative Freemasonry absorbed the traditions of the operative guilds, the mark was incorporated into ritual as the Mark Master degree, a ceremony in which the initiate received a personal mark and swore to honor it. Some 18th and 19th century gravestones carry not only the familiar square and compass, but also small idiosyncratic symbols, an X crossed with a horizontal bar, a stylized V with a diagonal line, a particular configuration of dots that represent the personal mark of the man buried there. These are the most intimate and most overlooked of all the symbolic messages left in stone, and at deciphering them, tracing a mark through multiple gravestones across generations, can reveal families' Masonic lineage with extraordinary precision. If you have access to old family papers, look for anything that appears to be a signature variant. Some Masonic men used their mark in correspondence as a kind of secondary signature, particularly in letters to fellow brothers. If you find a letter from an ancestor where the text is signed normally but followed by a small geometric symbol, you have found the mark. And with the mark, you can begin to trace it backward and forward through time. The archives that matter most for this kind of research are often not where genealogists first look. Beyond the Grand Lodge records already mentioned, county deed books from the 18th and 19th centuries frequently contain evidence of Masonic network activity in the form of land transactions clustered among lodge members. A man who bought land from another lodge brother, who borrowed money from another brother, who had his estate appraised by a third brother, these economic relationships formed the practical skeleton of the fraternal bond. Church records require careful reading in this context, because many lodge members maintain formal church membership while practicing their fraternal religion in parallel. But certain denominations, particularly the Presbyterians and the Methodists, were more tolerant of Masonic membership than others. Now their burial grounds contain a higher density of Masonic grave markers as a result. If your ancestors were Presbyterian or Methodist in New England or the Mid-Atlantic during the Federal period, walk their church cemeteries slowly. Look at every stone. Newspaper archives are another underused resource. The 19th century American press reported on lodge activities with a regularity that would surprise modern readers. Lodge meetings were announced. Masonic funerals, which were elaborate and distinctive public ceremonies, were described in detail. If your ancestor died between roughly 1820 and 1900 and was a lodge member of any standing, there is a reasonable probability that a local newspaper published an account of his Masonic funeral rites, naming his lodge and his degree. These accounts are preserved into newspaper archives, and searching them by name and date can yield remarkably precise information about a man's Masonic standing. The Masonic funeral itself left material traces. When a lodge member died, his brothers gathered at the funeral to perform specific rites: the laying of an evergreen sprig on the coffin, the recitation of certain passages, the arrangement of the brothers in a specific formation around the grave. If you have a family tradition, even a vague one, of an unusually formal or well-attended funeral for a particular ancestor, one where men appeared who were not obviously family members or neighbors, men who performed some kind of ceremony at the graveside, you may be remembering a Masonic funeral. The apron is the single most distinctive material object associated with lodge membership, and a significant number of them survive in family possession without being recognized for what they are. The Masonic apron, a direct descendant of the leather apron worn by operative stonemasons, was given to each member upon initiation and advanced through symbolic designs as he progressed through the degrees. Aprons were personal property, usually returned to the lodge at death or buried with the member, but some survive. If you have a white cloth apron in the family trunk, particularly one decorated with geometric symbols with what appears to be tassels or fringe at the corners, with embroidered imagery of pillars, arches, stars, or the all-seeing eye, do not assume it is a cooking apron or craft apron. Have it examined. It may be the most direct piece of evidence you will ever find of your family's hidden history. The network extended beyond any individual lodge. Through the system of traveling certificates, a lodge member who moved to a new location could present documentary proof of his membership and degree to any lodge in the world and receive recognition as a brother. This system created a web of mutual recognition that functioned, in practical terms, as a parallel social infrastructure. A man arriving in an unfamiliar city, presenting his traveling certificate to the local lodge, would find himself immediately connected to a network of men who were bound by oath to assist him, to provide employment references, to extend credit, to offer hospitality. In an era without credit bureaus, professional licensing bodies, or modern background checks, this network represented an extraordinary practical advantage. Which means that the Masonic connection in your family tree is not merely a curiosity of history, it explains things. It explains why your ancestor was able to establish himself in a new town with remarkable speed. It explains why the same small group of men appear repeatedly as witnesses, executors, and business partners across decades of your family documents. It explains the web of relationships that looks from the outside, a coincidence, but which was actually maintained by obligation and oath. They could not speak these things openly. The oath was explicit, and the penalties for violation, described in ritual in terms that were symbolic but understood as binding, were severe in the sense that mattered most to men of that era: social and economic ostracism, the withdrawal of the fraternal protection that had come to underpin their livelihoods and their families' security. So they kept silence, and in keeping silence, they became invisible to history, but they were not invisible to each other, and they left the record for you in the only place they could leave it safely, in stone. In the careful language of carved geometry on the faces of slate and marble monuments that were meant to last longer than any spoken word. In the specific phrase buried in the middle of a will's boilerplate language, in the ring at the bottom of a jewelry box, in the mark scratched into the cornerstone of a house that has been in your family for 200 years. You have been walking past these messages your entire life, without knowing you were standing in a library. Learn the symbols, pull the lodge records, raid the wills again, this time knowing what to look for. Write to the Grand Lodge of the state where your ancestors lived and ask if they maintain historical membership rolls. Search the digitized newspaper archives for your ancestor's name, combined with the words Masonic or Lodge or Fraternal. Walk the old cemetery with new eyes, crouching at each stone that lacks a cross, reading the geometry that someone carved there, not for the casual passerby, but for the initiated, for the blood, for you. They swore an oath of silence, but silenced does not mean erasure. They were builders, after all, men who understood that the things built with greatest care and greatest skill are the things that outlast everything else. They built their secret into the most permanent material available to them, and they built it last. 2 centuries have passed. The lodges where they gathered have been replaced by office buildings or parking lots, or simply returned to earth. The brothers who would have known them by their grip are dust. The oaths they swore have been whispered through generations and nearly lost, but the stone remains. The stone always remains. And now you know how to read it. They swore silenced to protect their families and their knowledge, but they carved a key into stone so that you, their blood, their bone, standing in a cold cemetery with fog at your ankles and old leaves on the graves, could finally unlock the truth about where you came from, about the oaths were sworn in your name before you were born, about the brotherhood that shaped the world your ancestors built and left to you. The eye has been watching from the stone this whole time. Now you know who it belongs to, and now you know who you are.